President of the National Chamber of Exporters, Secretary General, Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Shiham Marika, all of the office bearers, members of this association, friends, I'm extremely happy and privileged to have had this opportunity of addressing one of the most important stakeholders in the progress of Sri Lanka, the path to achieving prosperity, and all of you are an important ingredient in creating export-led economic growth and development. I would like to take this opportunity initially to provide you with a synopsis of the export strategy that a Samagi Jana Balawegaya government would be implementing. But prior to that, it is very important that we all understand the ground reality, the present day situation, and how we are trying to tackle the issues and ensure that export-led economic growth, shared prosperity, inclusive growth is not merely a phenomenon that is used on talk shows, that is, in fact, it is translated and transformed into practical reality. Right at the beginning, I would like to mention to you the fact that the Samagi Jana Balawegaya possesses a large pool of specialists, experts, academics. In fact, just the other day, we had the largest gathering of intellectuals and university academics who are part and parcel of our intellectual forum. So first and foremost, I would like to say we as a party follow a very rational decision-making model. We will not embark on making ad hoc decisions, or our policy prescriptions will not be knee-jerk reactions to challenges that we face in the governance process. So if you can have a look at the presentation board, we have the main three members of our economic team. I'm sure you all will see, hopefully within the month of May, our economic team and the economic team of our opponents embarking on a very fruitful and constructive debate, to be followed by the debate of the two leaders. And we hope that both these events will take place within the month of May. So these are the three members of our economic decision-making committee: Dr. Harsha De Silva, Honorable Kabir Hashim, Honorable Iran Vikramatne, all three of them distinguished members of parliament, and they have vast knowledge on economic issues, on economic policy and also issues related to the economic development process. We also have Talal Rafi, who is a consultant to many an international financial institution, who happens to be a prominent member of our intellectual forum. And we have a team that has gone through the difficult process of formulating our economic policy and our export strategy. So right at the outset, let's observe as to where we are right now. If I may explain to you some bare facts, the ground reality of Sri Lanka's export trajectory right now. As far as trade openness is concerned, we are at a very low ebb. Sri Lanka's trade openness in 2015 was 36.5%. In fact, when the liberalization process took place, way back in 1977, during the 7 years of Madam Sirimao Bandaranayaka's tenure, trade openness was at 36.4%. But within the next 2 years, by 1979, trade openness was at 72.2%. However, in 2015, we have come down to 36.5 levels. So we are back to the levels which we were in 1977. So as far as trade openness is concerned, we are in an unfavorable situation. Second, exports did not grow at the rate of the economy. Between 2000 and 2016, Sri Lanka's GDP grew at a compound rate of 10.4%, but exports only grew at 4%. Now, what does that say? It's a distinct sign that economic growth was largely concentrated in the non-tradable sector. Third, export growth from 2000 compared to other countries. Sri Lanka's exports increased 2.5 times from 2000 to 2022. However, during the same period, exports of Bangladesh increased tenfold. Exports of Vietnam increased 20-fold. Fourth, we have a basic problem of low exports of high-tech products. High-tech exports account for around 1% of Sri Lanka's total manufactured exports. Sri Lanka still relies on exports of products like apparels, which of course countries such as South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam started, but they actually moved away into high-valued goods. So the basic graphs exhibit the very sorry situation that we are in. So I mentioned these 4 issues as basic elements which are the ground realities in our export sector. Next, I would like to move on to the major challenges that we face in attaining growth in exports. Now, in the export sector, we lack diversification. Sri Lanka has not diversified its products for decades. A well-known distinguished economist, Professor Premachandra Atukorala, in his study has observed that between 2000 and 2015, Sri Lanka added just 7 new products to its export basket, which brought in a measly $100 million US. But during the same period, Vietnam added 48 new products to its export basket, which brought in $54 billion US in additional revenue. Not only did Vietnam add 7 times more products to its exports list, but on average, each of Vietnam's new products brought in 80 times more revenue when compared to Sri Lanka's export of additional products. So this basically shows that Sri Lanka still has not moved away from largely being dependent on the apparel and tea sectors. I don't in any way try to downgrade those sectors. While preserving and protecting those sectors and enhancing those sectors, we have to move on. We have to move on to the next stage. The Sri Lankan apparel industry requires $60 of imports for $100 of exports, resulting in a net export of $2 billion from the apparel industry annually. I say this not to devalue the importance of apparel industry in our export basket. We need to improve the value addition, and we need to inculcate new strategies, new approaches in order to do so. So the concern for Sri Lanka is that its 2 largest export sectors, apparel and tea, are products that consumers can and will cut down on during any economic downturns, which makes Sri Lanka's exports and balance of payments highly volatile. We need to diversify the export basket. We cannot be dependent on a few exports or on a few sectors. We must diversify our risks. In addition to the challenges in growing exports, the first one I mentioned, the lack of diversification in products. Second is the lack of diversification on markets. If you examine the figures, Sri Lanka has been over-reliant on a few markets for a larger portion of its exports. The United States, United Kingdom, and European countries are markets for over half of Sri Lanka's exports. This has meant that if there is any economic downturn in these Western countries, it will have a counterproductive effect, a depressive effect, a detrimental impact on Sri Lanka's exports. But there are opportunities. There are opportunities for us to have great access to alternative markets, such as China, India, the ASEAN countries, the Gulf Arab countries, the African continent, the South American continent, the Latin American nation states. So these are opportunities that we should grab. The third challenge that I would like to exhibit here is the low presence in global value chains. 70% of global trade is supplying global value chains. This is an area in which Sri Lanka has been left behind, and certainly Sri Lanka lacks traction. Even though 70% of global exports supply global value chains, Sri Lanka's exports for global manufacturing value chains as a percentage of its overall exports has been largely around single digits. If you examine these tables, I hope you can see the detailed figures. These tables tell you the sorry state as far as Sri Lanka's presence in the global value chain. The fourth challenge that we face is the difficulty in competing with other Asian countries as far as costs are concerned. Sri Lanka has great difficulties in competing with other nations in South Asia due to high energy costs, transportation, and labor costs. Sri Lanka's energy costs are almost 3 times higher than India's and almost 4 times higher than Bangladesh. Sri Lanka is also the richest country in South Asia in terms of GDP per capita. This means Sri Lanka cannot compete with its South Asian peers on costs, especially cheap labor costs, and will have to move towards knowledge-intensive exports. This particular graph explains to you the argument that I just presented. The fifth challenge is the problems provided by the regulations and costly quality certifications that we have in our country. Sri Lanka is ranked 99th in the last World Bank Ease of Doing Business report. It is not perceived to be an easy environment to conduct business. Let's take, for example, the exporting of gems. All gem sellers must come to Colombo, to the National Gem and Jewellery Authority, to get approval, which according to gem merchants can take up to 5 hours. So for someone living out of Colombo, this entails traveling, which end up costing a day in time. In comparison, in Thailand, gems can be sold from the house or shop through DHL or FedEx. Many SMEs are turned off from exporting due to high costs of quality certifications and the time taken to process them. So I just gave you a succinct summary of first the basic elements, the ground realities, and the challenges that we are facing. Now, what do we recommend? What ought to be our export policy or export strategy? Let me try to explain to you what we hope to implement in a SJB administration to ameliorate the obstacles and difficulties that we face and to try and formulate a sound export policy which will propel Sri Lanka's growth in leaps and bounds. First, we must attract export-driven foreign direct investments. Sri Lanka lacks the capital to shift to exports in high-valued exports. And therefore, we need foreign direct investment. Not only in terms of capital requirements, but also to get the skills and technology transfers. 64% of all exports globally are done by multinational companies. 82% of knowledge-intensive exports globally are done by multinational companies. About 70% of Vietnam's exports come from companies in Vietnam, which have foreign investments in them. 20% of Vietnam's total exports are done by one South Korean company, namely Samsung. Sri Lanka does not need to rely on local companies to increase exports, but we need to attract exporting multinational companies. Second, we have to tap into the global value chains. 70% of global trade is supplying global value chains. It is by finding a niche in the supply chains of large multinational companies like Apple, Toyota, and supplying that niche that many countries like Vietnam are expanding their exports. This attracts foreign direct investments. And it also encourages intra-industry trade. Southeast Asia is one of the most successful regions when it comes to trade. And they did this by moving from economies that were export-oriented to economies that worked on global supply chains. Southeast Asia has a high percentage of trade within its region. And a reason is that they are most involved in intra-industry trade. Even within supply chains of large organizations, Southeast Asian countries find their comparative advantage. So in a SJB administration, we would certainly attract export-driven foreign direct investments. We will formulate our policies to achieve those ends. And we will also tap into the global value chains and become stakeholders and partners in that process. Third, Sri Lanka, if we are to have fast scale, fast growth, we have to ensure that we have more and more free trade agreements and diversify our export markets. We have to ensure that we attain free trade agreements that accrue to us a competitive advantage. Let me give you an example for you to have a better understanding of the situation. Chile and Sri Lanka were the first countries to open up their economies in the 1970s. Right now, Chile has 44 trade agreements, while Sri Lanka has only 3 bilateral agreements. Chile is an advanced economy today with its GDP per capita at over 16,000. But Sri Lanka's is still under 4,000. Vietnam and Sri Lanka were exporting roughly the same amounts in the early 1990s. But today, Vietnam exports 30 times more than Sri Lanka. A primary reason among many is that Vietnam was aggressive in signing free trade agreements with other countries and with other regional blocs, while the Sri Lankan decision makers and policy makers were sitting on their backsides and laurels. Its trade agreement with the United States, that is Vietnam's, gave it access to a large market with its trade agreement. With China, it allowed to go ahead with importing intermediate goods easily and cheaply. So with United States, you had access to a large market. With China, you were able to import intermediate goods in a cheap manner. Most foreign investors want to invest in manufacturing in a country like Sri Lanka to fulfill a part of the supply chain where Sri Lanka would have a comparative advantage. For Sri Lanka to be an ideal situation for export-driven foreign direct investments, it has to have FTAs with a comparative advantage so that it can freely import and also be able to export to many countries with less tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers. Sri Lanka's 22 million population and an economy below $80 billion is not attractive for large-scale investors like Samsung. Bilateral free trade agreements and joining regional trade blocs like RCEP will open up the opportunity for Sri Lankan businesses to export more and find new markets. So basically, we have to go ahead with signing more and more free trade agreements. Of course, agreements not blind, not willy-nilly, but agreements that accrue benefits to Sri Lanka. Agreements that enable us to attain a comparative advantage. Fourth, we need to expand into high-value exports. As pointed out earlier, between 2000 and 2015, Sri Lanka added just 7 new products to its export basket, which brought in $100 million a year in additional revenue. But in the same period, Vietnam added 48 new products to its exports basket and brought in $54 billion in additional revenue. So Vietnam's story of exporting goods that were of higher value started with one company setting up in Vietnam. This was Samsung, which set up a factory and started producing in Vietnam. What were the consequences? The smaller Vietnamese businesses started to develop to supply the Samsung factories. This led to an expansion of the ecosystem and infrastructure to deal with high-valued production. Once these were there, other foreign companies started setting up manufacturing plants in Vietnam. We have planned out a program and a strategy to follow the same in our country. And we will embark on a time-targeted, results-oriented approach to achieve these ends. Look at Costa Rica, another country that has grown exponentially in exports compared to Sri Lanka. Costa Rica exports of high-valued goods commenced with Intel, the famous company, setting up in Costa Rica. This led to an ecosystem of suppliers and infrastructure being set up. Once that was in place, it attracted other high-valued products producing global giants to set up in Costa Rica. Tamil Nadu, the state of India, is also an excellent example. So foreign direct investment must be seen not only in terms of financial benefits, but also in terms of skills and also technology transfer. In addition, we need to increase productivity and innovation. We have an aging population, and our population is not growing as fast as our other South Asian countries. Therefore, it is best to focus on increasing productivity of the limited human capital Sri Lanka has. Only 10% of Sri Lanka's students passing A-levels have a place in state universities. Another 10% do vocational training courses. Around 5% from well-off backgrounds take up private education in Sri Lanka or go abroad. This means 75% of students leaving schools are not being utilized. They either become tuk-tuk drivers, three-wheel drivers, security guards, etc. For Sri Lanka to produce high-valued goods and services, a well-educated workforce is needed. Even in universities, only a small portion are into STEM education, which is essential for the country to grow and for promoting export-focused industries. Setting up more engineering and information communication technology related educational institutes can greatly enhance the human capital of Sri Lanka, which is a factor many multinational companies consider before investing in a country to produce high-valued goods. Sri Lanka also needs to focus on innovation. Innovation and economic growth are related. To be more innovative, Sri Lanka needs to spend more on research and development. Sri Lanka only spends 0.18% of GDP on R&D. Vietnam spends 3 times, and India almost 5 times more in terms of GDP when compared to Sri Lanka. Switzerland ranks as the most innovative nation in the world consistently. And one key reason is because in Switzerland, research and development of large companies is outsourced to universities. As universities are given more and more research and development work, they become better at it and are able to support the companies that come to them in the aftermath. It also results in students from these universities having better industrial knowledge before graduating. You may have seen some of the initiatives that we have undertaken while being in opposition. For example, the Sakvala program, where we try to promote and encourage information, communication, technology education in the present state educational structure, which is right now in a very sorry state. We have 10,126 state schools teaching 4.1 million students. We have successive governments, administrations, presidents grandly proclaiming that Sri Lanka will be made an IT hub. But are you aware that IT as a subject is only taught from grades 6 to 13? And it is taught in the mother language. And it's an optional subject. By the end of this year, We hope to provide all 10,126 schools with the requisite physical and human resources and embark on a voyage of making Sri Lanka truly an IT hub. In order to do so, we will make sure that ICT is a compulsory subject, taught from not just 6 to 13, but from grade 1 to 13. And the teaching will certainly take place in English. We hope to make that transformation. Already, we have exhibited a microcosm of the work that we hope to implement through the Smart Classroom project, namely Sakwala. So in order to jumpstart, accelerate, promote, champion exports, I mentioned attracting foreign direct investment, tapping into global value chains, increasing the number of FTAs that Sri Lanka signs up to, expansion into high-valued exports, increasing productivity and innovation. We will also support SMEs in export promotion. As you know, the micro, small and medium-sized enterprises and industries are the engine of Sri Lanka's economic growth. They contribute to approximately 52% of gross domestic product. And through certain calculations, close to 4 million are employed in the MSMEs. SMEs employ a large portion of labor when compared to other corporations. And in a world where 70% of trade is in supplying global value chains, SMEs can be driven to exports. Access to affordable finance is essential, along with training and access to markets. We need to have an innovative, vibrant government institution that champions MSMEs in our country. We need to make sure that the traditional bureaucratic hindrances, the red tape that hinder the growth of MSMEs are gotten rid of, and we shall certainly do so. Setting up one-stop shops for promoting exports is also very important. I hope you remember then President Ranasinghe Premadasa was the one-stop shop in promoting the 200 garment factory process. I remember observing one day in one of the events of his calendars, which usually took place every Monday of the week. The meeting, its maximum duration was 15 minutes. You had the international investors on one side, and you had the government officials on the other side. The president came in with his diary, opened his diary, gave dates 3 months ahead for the garment factory openings, and then instructed both the investors and the bureaucracy to make sure everything else was done. Now, of course, we are in 2024. We don't need to have the president doing that on a weekly basis. We must establish structures, institutions, have the relevant standard operating procedures that achieve those results. we need to have a well-oiled machine that promotes investments and exports. Lastly, we need to support industries with comparative advantages. 40% of global exports are concentrated trade, which means only 2-3 countries produce that product. For example, soya beans are produced primarily on a vast scale by the United States and Brazil. Semiconductors, Taiwan. Sri Lanka is a nation of just 22 people with an aging population and a debt, both foreign and domestic combined, at a very, very high level, more than 128% of GDP. It has limited human and financial resources. So we need to focus on industries with a comparative advantage. I personally believe that the IT sector, business process outsourcing sector, is an excellent area for Sri Lanka to initiate on a vast scale. We can use this sector to make Sri Lanka an information technology hub. IT exports can be achieved at breakneck speed, and with proper guidance and governmental facilitation, we can achieve those tasks. We also need, just lastly, to strengthen horizontal policies to improve exports. Georgia is a good example. We need improved governance, education, infrastructure, trade facilitation, trade liberalization. Georgia is a good example for education. Malaysia for infrastructure. Chile for tariff reductions. And Rwanda, today known as the Singapore of Africa, for governance. Just last, I would like to give you some case studies, proven successes, which a SJB administration would try to emulate. I would like to point you to the exporting champions that have established themselves. Take a country like Chile. They have become one of the largest exporters of wine. They have used the policy of flat tariff rates to encourage exports. And Chilean government has set up a separate unit called Pro Chile in order to promote training, international positioning for Chilean exports. And Chile is one of the great examples of a model that has promoted green exports. We have Japan and its Ministry of Industry and Trade, well known as MITI, performing a tremendous task in the 60s and 70s, 80s decades. MITI was known as the external economic foreign policy arm of the Japanese government. It played a valuable role, integral part in making Japan an export hub. How would you compare MITI of Japan with its counterpart in Sri Lanka, EDB, Export Development Board? I personally feel it's an absolute white elephant. It needs to be reformed. It needs to be injected with innovation, energy, talent. It needs to be more capable. And EDB needs to be task-oriented. Or else it's far profitable for Sri Lanka to scrap EDB. We need a MITI in our country, and we shall establish it. I mentioned IT as one of the major areas in which we can prosper. Take the example of Karnataka and its IT revolution. I promise you, with a time-targeted approach, with the wish of the people, the blessings of the people, if we are given the opportunity of governing this country, we will ensure that all 25 administrative districts in our country will possess IT hubs. Taking Karnataka as an example. Karnataka accounts for 40% of India's IT exports. Bengaluru is said to be the fastest growing city in the Asia Pacific region. The city is a leader in IT innovation. It is attracting a vast number of venture capitalists, and they hold the second spot in Asia Pacific in terms of the top tech hubs. In fact, Karnataka has become India's Silicon Valley, housing over 80% of major global IT offices. Software exports have skyrocketed from Indian rupees 160 million in 91 and 92 to a staggering 6.3 trillion Indian rupees today. And it employs over 4 million, 40 lakhs. So, how did Karnataka become the IT hub? It promoted the creation of an educated workforce. It has around half of India's research and developmental institutions. It has established software technology parks with tax breaks, reliable infrastructure, and other many benefits for IT companies. They provide tax breaks on equipment purchases for IT firms. They have also implemented the Karnataka startup policy in 2015, offering financial aid, incubators, and support for startups. Certainly, this is a very good example for Sri Lanka to follow, and we will do so. Next and last, I would like to show you the example of Taiwan's progress through its semiconductor industry. Do you know China imports $430 billion in semiconductors, and 36% of the imports come from its arch enemy, Taiwan. Taiwan took a critical step in establishing industrial technology research institutes to propel their tech industry and economy. Taiwan's chip production surpassed the United States, grabbing the second largest supplier spot globally. Currently, Taiwan reigns supreme with TSMC, a Taiwanese company leading the industry. Semiconductor exports are a significant contributor to Taiwan's economy, accounting for nearly a quarter of GDP in 2022. So, my friends, I have recited a very long story. I thought I should do so because we need solid policy. We need policy with substance. We need policy that achieves. We need policy that achieves results according to a strict timetable. Initially, I went through the major elements, the present day status as far as exports are concerned. We went through the major challenges that we face, and we went through the major recommendations for a comprehensive export policy for our country. So I hope that this presentation, it's not the normal speech of the traditional politician. This speech is based on knowledge, intelligence, professionalism in governance. And the rest of the time, I will open the floor for all of you to question me, to interrogate me, to examine me, and check the suitability for Sri Lanka's leadership. And it's not just individuality. We have a brilliant team. We have a superb team. And make no mistake, we aim to achieve. We will achieve. We will make Sri Lanka great.